Good evening, everyone. My name is John Hughes. I'm the music director of the Chicago Master Singers. Welcome to another session of CMS University. I'm really glad you're here. Whether this is your first time tuning in or you've been watching this entire series going back to August, you are part of the online community that we're building. Now, one of the ways that we facilitate this community is through the chat window on the right-hand side of your screen. You'll see people are making connections, saying hello, tuning in from across the country, even across multiple countries outside the United States. So it's quite the thing that we're building here, and participating in the chat helps you feel even more connected if you want to. So the first thing you need to do is make sure you're logged into YouTube, and then you'll be able to join the conversation. You can even ask me a question, and you can start it with 3 or 4 question marks in a row so I can kind of easily see what's intended for me. And I'll, from time to time, look over at the window and put the questions up on the screen, and I'll try my best to answer it. I love seeing the likes coming in. I've been working for about 30 seconds now, but I'm glad you're already enjoying the presentation. So, a couple things before we get into our topic for tonight, which is all about spirituals, how they developed and have evolved and transformed over the centuries. Now, as any good professor would do, I have a few kind of preliminary statements that I'd like to make to kind of set the table for our discussion. The first is this quote by Antonin Dvorak, which I'll let you read on your own. But basically, what he's saying is that the spiritual is really integral to any kind of art music or any music in general that America would develop. And I chose this topic for a couple reasons that I want to explain to you. First, today is the day that we as a nation commemorate Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and so I thought this was a fitting topic to put on on the day that we celebrate his life and his work and reflect on how we can continue his work in our own lives. The second thing, and the reason I am talking about this particular quote, is that I think that far too often choirs view spirituals as a nice add-on. That they end the concert, they're a crowd pleaser, they're a way to get the audience to stand up for that standing ovation right at the end of the concert. While that's probably done with good intentions, I think that sets the spiritual aside from the quote-unquote real repertoire of Western European composers like Bach and Mozart and Brahms and Beethoven, all the composers we also love. My point tonight, though, and what I want you to take away from this presentation, is that the spiritual tradition, and really every tradition, including, but in addition to, the Western European tradition, is of equal value and has its own distinct history, its own remarkable composers and arrangers, its own worth on our programs. And so I really want to challenge you to kind of think about the spiritual in a new way, perhaps, and in a way that really fully envelops this wonderful tradition that we're going to learn about tonight. And I hope that you will kind of see and hear the development of this really crucial part of choral repertoire, because this is equally part of choral repertoire as other kinds of music too. The other kind of preliminary comment that I want to make here is that a lot of the material that I'm talking about tonight comes from this book by Dr. Andre J. Thomas, who I'll be profiling toward the end of the presentation. But this book is really just a jackpot of information, so I invite you to check it out. At the very end of tonight's presentation, I'll give you some other resources that you can consult if you're interested in learning even more about the spiritual tradition. All right, without any more to do, let's get into what exactly are spirituals, because I think this is a term a lot of choral singers are familiar with, and I want to talk about what they are in great detail. So the spirituals really developed out of a confluence of two cultures. The first being the African cultures that were forcibly brought here during slavery. And you can see on the left-hand side here this quote by the ethnomusicologist Bruno Nettel, that he argues that the African cultures have much more innate music and dancing and composition and improvisation that is innate to their culture. On the other side, we have the Christian themes of patience and forbearance, love, faith, and hope. And it's the combination of these two cultures, that of the African slaves who were brought here and the Christian ideas, that then formed the spiritual. And here's a quote from Harry T. Burleigh, one of the great arrangers that we'll talk about. And he said that the spiritual has its roots in an oral tradition, right? So we're going to talk a lot about the oral tradition and then how it transitioned into a written form that we are more familiar with today. That these oral traditions really grew out of a spontaneous outburst of intense religious fervor. So that spontaneous outburst might have been inspired by African culture and the Christian religious fervor out of the new culture that they were assimilated into against their will. So it's these two things that then combine to make the spiritual. Now, there are other related genres, but the strictest definition of a spiritual, in my opinion, is that one has to have its roots in slavery. So, in other words, there aren't new spirituals. Maybe there are spirituals that are written today that are inspired by spirituals or are trying to mimic that, but a strict definition would be they have to have their roots in slavery, and two, that they are sacred, that they have a religious connotation. So these other genres, the shout, the field holler, the work songs, gospel music, they all share similarities to the spiritual tradition, but are different. So let's go through them. The shout is kind of a religious chant that would have kind of been mesmerizing, where people would have done these after their religious services, and it might have involved movement. It was more monotone, a chant, and it could have lasted up to several hours long. There were also field hollers. These were non-spiritual, I called it functional music. So maybe someone going into a field and kind of announcing their presence through a song. That would be a field holler. Or asking for a drink of water. Those were the examples that Andre Thomas used. So that it definitely has its roots in slavery, but wasn't necessarily religious. The work songs meant to accompany specific tasks. So, digging a hole or whatever they were being forced to do. Again, had its roots in slavery, but weren't necessarily religious. Finally, we have gospel music, right, which we all know and love, but that is really a more recent invention. It doesn't have its roots in slavery, but it is religious. So that's kind of the distinction between a spiritual and gospel. Now, one other thing to note here is that a lot of spirituals might sound like a religious song or even a work song, but have kind of a hidden meaning talking about escaping or other kind of coded language. So just remember that that is also part of the spiritual tradition. Okay, so as I said, the tradition really begins with an oral transmission, right? These were not written down. They were passed on for generations. But eventually, they did kind of transition to a written form, and I have a few early sources to share with you. The first is called Slave Songs of the United States. This was compiled in 1867 by this group of really musicologists who went down to the southern plantations and interviewed slaves and newly freed slaves. Remember that just because the Civil War ended in 1865 didn't mean that all the slaves were immediately released, right? It took a long time for news to travel. So anyway, they went down to the South and interviewed slaves, and they transcribed their songs. So here on the right-hand side, you'll see Roll, Jordan, Roll, a great spiritual, And they transcribed it very literally, including dialect, because they wanted to catalog this music. They also provided some commentary on how the songs were being sung. So this is really kind of an archival project. A few years later, we have the Fisk Jubilee Singers, and this is a page from that, Steal Away. You might be familiar with that. This is affiliated with Fisk University, and throughout this evening, you'll hear reference to a lot of universities that are considered HBCUs, or historically black college and universities. And these institutions, like Fisk University, really almost immediately solidified the spiritual tradition and protected it and archived it for us. So in this in this book, The Fisk Jubilee Singers, the first part talks a little bit about the formation of this group, why they were formed, and how it worked. The second half then provides 139 songs that they sang. And if you look at the date, it's not that far after the end of the Civil War. In Cabin and Plantation Songs from 1874, again, this is compiled by Thomas P. Feener, who was affiliated with Hampton University. This is really the first attempt to arrange the songs for performance instead of transcribing them as they would have been sung. So this is kind of a big step forward in a way for spirituals becoming concert music. So this is a good source to be aware of. The last one that I want to talk about is this Before the War Spirituals from 1933. This was transcribed by two musicologists who were focused on preserving the songs and traditions before they disappeared. This is kind of when a lot of people who were born into slavery were beginning to pass away. And so this was an attempt to really capture it from that kind of native speaker, if you will, of the spiritual and preserve them for time going forward. It presented all the music and the text with dialect with no alteration in order to capture that. So after all these transitions, now we're kind of fully in the written form. And what we're going to do for the rest of this evening is talk about four groups of arrangers in chronological order. Now you'll notice that I'm talking about arrangers because if you buy the premise that a spiritual, by the strictest definition, had to have its roots in slavery, then there can't be a new spiritual, right? Everything is arranged. And so that's what we're talking about. They are taking existing melodies and arranging them for the choral ensemble. And these groupings that I'm talking about tonight, again, are straight out of that Andre J. Thomas book. And you can read profiles of all the arrangers that you'll see tonight. So the first group here is called the early nationalistic arrangers. These are people born between 1866 and 1896. So you might see some familiar names here, and I'll talk about a few in detail. The first one we already heard from tonight is Harry Burleigh. He is one of the earliest arrangers of spirituals, and what he would do is he would take a spiritual, like for example, we're going to listen to My Lord, What a Morning, and he would arrange it for multiple voicings. He'd arrange it for choir. He'd arrange it for solo voice in high, medium, and low keys, right? So he made it really possible for a lot of people to perform and hear the spiritual. So it was a really kind of smart way of proliferating this music. Now he is a really key person, not only because of his arrangements, but because he studied with Dvorak in New York City. And it is he, Harry Burleigh, who introduced Dvorak to the entire spiritual tradition. So we have him to thank in a way for the great New World Symphony that Dvorak would eventually produce. Now, I read too that Dvorak actually made an arrangement of a spiritual, and Burleigh performed it as a tenor soloist with Dvorak at Madison Square Garden. So this is a really, really important man. We're going to listen to his performance of his My Lord, What a Morning, And you might know that sometimes people spell this with a U in mourning to connote like the sadness after a death. So it's kind of an interesting textual note. All right, let's listen to this performance. Beautiful, right? Now, I saw a question in the chat about the original source material. I'm not exactly sure, but my impression, just looking at some of these manuscripts, is that a lot of these spirituals were preserved as just the melody line, and it doesn't mean that they were sung that way originally. I'm sure harmonies and counter melodies were improvised, but I think the way they were kind of preserved were in more just the melody. But I'm not exactly sure about that. Okay, our next composer you may have heard of, or arranger I should say, is R. Nathaniel Dett. Now, he came to the United States to study at the Oberlin School, and he really had a multifaceted career as a composer, conductor, arranger, and educator, and eventually he taught at the Hampton Institute. Now, in addition to certainly just arranging spirituals for choral ensembles, he often integrated these melodies into instrumental works or other kind of freely composed pieces. So he didn't just strictly arrange them. Sometimes he would quote from spirituals. Now, his most famous arrangement is Listen to the Lambs, and let's listen to a performance of that. I'll try and remember here to share the performers' names with you. That last one, Listen to the Lambs, was Winston-Salem State University. Okay, our final arranger from the early group here is William Grant Still. He is really one of the most honored African-American composers of his generation. Like Det, he studied at Oberlin, and he holds the distinct honor of being the first African-American to conduct a major symphony orchestra, the LA Phil, in 1936. Now, we hear and know of William Grant Still mostly as an orchestral composer. That's where a lot of his pieces are performed today. I'm really grateful that in an effort to diversify their offerings, we hear a lot of his music on WFMT here in Chicagoland these days. But he also wrote a number of choral compositions, including some spiritual arrangements. And we're going to listen to a performance from, I believe, the University of Central Florida, a performance of one of his more famous spiritual settings called The Blind Man. Okay, we're going to move on to the second group of arrangers, what Thomas refers to as the middle period arrangers. And you'll notice as we progress through this evening that maybe those first group of composers or arrangers really set the spirituals in a very kind of sincere way that wasn't encumbered by a lot of extra stuff. So if they're accompanied by piano, the piano is really acting in an accompanimental fashion. The melodies are presented very simply and unadorned. That doesn't mean that they are simple pieces of music necessarily, because there's so much humanness going into those pieces. But we'll see in this middle and later group of arrangers kind of an expansion of what the art form can be in its complexity. So the first person we're going to talk about in this middle period arrangers group is William Dawson. I think that's a name a lot of us choral people are familiar with. He attended the prestigious Tuskegee Institute and later became its director. And he had a few connections to Chicago that I wasn't familiar with. First of all, he earned a master's degree from the American Conservatory, which I believe is now affiliated with Roosevelt University. And he actually served as the first chair trombone player in the Civic Orchestra. So he must have been a very, very expert player. And I was not familiar with that until I started working on this presentation. Now, in his arrangements, we'll start to see this overlapping of syncopated rhythmic motivic cells. And this then starts to get distinguish it from those earlier arrangements. So we're going to listen to a real fun arrangement called I Want to Be Ready.
I want to be ready, oh, I want to be ready. I want to be ready to walk in Jerusalem just like John. I want to be ready, oh, I want to be ready. I want to be ready to walk in Jerusalem just like John.
John said the city was just 4 square.
To walk in Jerusalem just like John.
And he declared he'd meet me there.
To walk in Jerusalem just like John.
I ain't been to heaven, but I've been told
To walk in Jerusalem just like John.
that the streets of pearl and the gates are gold.
To walk in Jerusalem just like John. I want to be ready, oh, I want to be ready. I want to be ready to walk in Jerusalem just like John. I want to be ready, oh, I want to be ready. I want to be ready to walk in Jerusalem just like John.
You said your Lord has set you free.
To walk in Jerusalem just like John.
Why don't you let your neighbor see?
To walk in Jerusalem just like John.
I never shall forget that day
To walk in Jerusalem just like John.
when Jesus washed my sins away.
To walk in Jerusalem just like John. I want to be ready, oh, I want to be ready. I want to be ready to walk in Jerusalem just like John. I want to be ready, oh, I want to be ready. I want to be ready to walk in Jerusalem just like John. I want to be ready, oh, I want to be ready. I want to be ready to walk in Jerusalem just like John.
So there we had a great performance conducted by William Dawson himself. And you just love to hear how the vinyl sounds, right? So this gives us a huge insight into how he envisioned this arrangement being performed. And we'll hear several other pieces tonight where the arranger is the conductor too. And that is always kind of a special way to get to know the piece. The next arranger that we're going to talk about is Chester Hairston. And his dates really struck me. He lived a nice long life, and he died in 2000. But it's always remarkable that he was the grandson of former slaves. So I think sometimes it's tempting to feel like slavery was so long ago. But someone like Hairston shows how long this is part of our culture. Now, he was a real ambassador in quite a literal way He served the U.S. State Department as an ambassador of goodwill, and he was also an ambassador for the spiritual. This quote here is saying that no other arranger has been more responsible for inspiring and invigorating performances of the spiritual than Chester Hairston. So really kind of a disciple for the art form. He also had a great acting career, both in radio and then eventually TV when that developed. And we're going to listen to probably his most famous arrangement, which is Elijah Rock. I love that ending. That was the Atlanta Master Chorale under the direction of Eric Nelson. Okay, we're going to talk about Undine Smith more here. She was a tremendous force in the spiritual and just music tradition. She earned degrees from Fisk and Columbia Universities, and she also completed studies at the Eastman and Manhattan Schools of Music. She went on to co-found the Black Music Center at Virginia State, where she really devoted her life's work to promoting the music of Black musicians in the U.S. Now, she's best known for her choral music, although she wrote in many different idioms, but she is best known for her choral music, and that's the genre that she preferred to write in the most. Now, she has a lot of choral works, but she's best known for Daniel, Daniel, Servant of the Lord, which is really exciting. And you'll start to see the rhythm really pervades so many of these arrangements from this period. So let's listen to this one.
Oh, the king cried, oh, Daniel, Daniel, oh, Daniel, Daniel, oh, a very Hebrew Daniel, servant of the Lord. Oh, the king cried, oh, Daniel, Daniel, oh, Daniel, Daniel, oh, a very Hebrew Daniel, servant of the Lord. Daniel, 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 oh.
Now the king in his sleep was troubled, and early in the morning he rose, to find that God had sent his angel Lord to lock the lion's jaws. Oh, the king cried, oh,
It's a lot of sound for 12 singers to put out, but that's such a great arrangement, and I hope you enjoyed that one. We're going to talk about our next category of arrangers, is what Thomas referred to as the modern arrangers, people born between 1928 and 58. So here's our full list, or at least his full list. And I want to highlight just a few of them. The first one being Robert Harris. Now, Harris recently retired from Northwestern University, where he was the director of choral activities. And prior to that, he served at Michigan State as well as Wayne State. Now, these are all really good programs that he headed. He was also the chair twice for the choral panel of the National Endowment of the Arts. So a real tall figure in our field, and right here in Chicago. Or Chicagoland, I guess. Now, his style can be challenging at times, and we're going to see this as we continue learning more about the spiritual, that from this very kind of sincere, straightforward arrangements of Burleigh through Harris and continuing on, we're going to see an expansion, right? Not only of the rhythmic language, but the harmonic language, right? These chords are going to get bigger and bigger, more extended harmonies, and I think Harris's piece here, Go Down Moses, exemplifies this more adventurous harmony, more difficult music. But I think it's equally rewarding. So let's take a listen.
Let
was a high B at the end. That soprano crushed that. That's a hard solo to have, and I thought she did a good job. Okay, now we're going to listen to the man I've been talking about all night, Andre J. Thomas. He's a really prolific arranger and composer, and also an educator. He recently retired from Florida State University, where he had a great career, and his legacy lives on with many of his students who went through his doctoral program there, and who are now assuming some of the top positions in the choral field. After retiring from Florida State, he is now serving Yale University in an interim capacity for the past couple years. Now, Thomas is interesting because he really treats each spiritual differently, in that he uses different forces. Some arrangers tend to write mostly for unaccompanied chorus, or some with piano. But Thomas, really each arrangement that he does is completely different. Some are unaccompanied, some are for piano, some are for full orchestra in the case of Band of Angels, which we're going to listen to in a minute. And I really think that's just interesting because every one of his spirituals really sounds different, and it makes his whole catalog really exciting. Now, the reason I chose Band of Angels is that it showcases his style, and it's a shorter spiritual arrangement, but it's for full orchestra, and so you get so much more color with all the instruments playing along. So I hope you enjoy this arrangement. Okay, on to our final. Oh, I'm sorry. One of the most important of these modern arrangers, Moses Hogan. You can see from his dates, he died unfortunately young in 2003. And he really revitalized the performance of spirituals. And the way he did this, in the late 90s, one of his choirs performed at an ACDA convention. And it just blew all the choir directors in the country away. And then, being the smart businessman that he was, he had arrangements of all these pieces for sale. And this really revitalized the spirituals and really cemented their place in choral programming today. As I mentioned, one of the ways he did this was not only through his arrangements, but through his performances. He had multiple choirs and that he would travel the country with, giving these performances of his spirituals. Now, one of the other things that he accomplished in his life was editing the Oxford Book of Spirituals. Now, this was a tremendous, just professional accomplishment, but I think it also is a signifier of the importance of the spirituals and that they were really becoming viewed as equal part in the repertoire. The Oxford Publishing House has books of Italian madrigals and French chansons and sea shanties and all these other things. So the fact that then they produced and he edited the Oxford Book of Spirituals really shows its stature in the repertoire. So we're going to listen to one of his great arrangements. They all are great, but one of my favorites, Joshua Fit the Battle of Jericho.
Joshua fit the battle, it's the battle of Jericho. Joshua fit the battle, it's the battle of Jericho. Joshua the battle of Jericho. The battle Jericho. The battle Jericho. The battle Joshua. The battle Jericho. The battle Joshua. The battle Joshua fit the battle, yes, the battle of Jericho. Joshua fit the battle, yes, the battle of Jericho. Joshua the battle of Jericho. The battle Jericho. The battle Jericho. The battle Joshua. The battle Jericho, the battle Joshua, the battle Joshua fit the battle, yes, the battle of Jericho. Joshua fit the battle, yes, the battle of Jericho.
Talk about your kings of Gideon.
Go on, we can
Talk about your men of Saul.
Go on, yes, you can talk about him.
Good old Joshua at the battle of Jericho.
Joshua, the battle 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 Joshua fit the battle, yes, the battle of Jericho. Joshua fit the battle, yes, the battle of Jericho.
Right up to the walls of Jericho.
Jericho,
He marched with spear in hand.
blow and horn, Joshua.
Well, Joshua cried.
Cause the battle lamb in my hand.
God Almighty,
Then
then
the
the
lamb she calls begins to blow. As the trumpet begins to sound.
and the walls come tumbling down. Oh Lord, you know that Joshua fit the battle, yes, the battle of Jericho. Joshua fit the battle, yes, the battle of Jericho. Joshua fit the battle, yes, the battle of Jericho. The walls come
Tumbling down.
oh Lord, you know that Joshua fit the battle, yes, the battle of Jericho. Joshua fit the battle, yes, the battle of Jericho. Joshua fit the battle, yes, the battle of Jericho.
There's really no chords like Moses Hogan chords at the end of pieces. They're some of the best. Okay, our final category of arrangers tonight is the contemporary arrangers. And I hope you're starting to hear the difference of each iteration and each group or generation of arrangers. And, I could talk all about the transformation and evolution of spirituals, or I figured it might just be best to let you hear the difference. Our first one of this final group is Stacey Gibbs. Stacey Gibbs lives in near Detroit and actually makes his living not off of music, although I'm sure he could make his living off of music now. But he has a full-time business that he runs as his job. Now, similarly to Moses Hogan, Stacey Gibbs kind of erupted on the choral music scene with dozens and dozens of really fresh, hip, new arrangements of spirituals. And he draws his inspiration for his arrangements from two people. First, William Dawson, with whom he studied, and Dawson told him to always embrace the spiritual with pride and humility, so that's something that Gibbs tries to do. He also looks to Hall Johnson, who's one of the earlier period arrangers, for the sense of rhythm, and that there's kind of the subdivisional pulse is going throughout the piece. And you'll hear that in this arrangement of Rockin' Jerusalem.
Mary, Mary, oh Mary, Martha, oh Mary, Mary, won't you ring out bells? Mary, Mary, oh Mary, Martha, oh Mary, Mary, won't you ring out bells? Don't you hear them ringing, right? Oh Mary, oh Mary, oh Mary, ring out bells, oh Mary, oh Martha, ring out bells, just a ring out bells. I hear angels are rocking to Jerusalem. I hear angels are ringing out bells. I hear angels are rocking to Jerusalem. Ring out bells, just a ring out bells. I'm singing church getting higher. Oh Lord, yes, church getting higher. Yes, Lord, I said the church getting higher. Oh Lord, church getting higher. Rocking, ringing, ringing, rock. Oh Mary, oh Mary, oh Mary, ring them bells. Oh Mary, oh Mother, ring them bells, just a ring them bells. I hear angels are rocking to Jerusalem. I hear angels are ringing them bells. I hear angels are rocking to Jerusalem. Ring them bells, just a ring them bells. I'm singing New Jerusalem. Oh Lord, yes, New Jerusalem. Yes, Lord, I said that New Jerusalem. Oh Lord, New Jerusalem, rocking, ringing, ringing, oh Mary, oh Jerusalem, oh Mary, ring them bells, oh Mary, oh Jerusalem, ring them bells, just a ring them bells. I hear angels are rocking to Jerusalem. I hear angels are ringing them bells. I hear angels are rocking to Jerusalem. Ring them bells, just a ring them bells. Rock, rock, oh rockin', rockin', rock, oh rockin', rock, rock, oh rockin', ring them, ring them, rock, rock, oh rockin', rockin', rock, oh rockin', rock, rock, oh rockin', ring them bells.
What a great ending to show the bells, right? It's clever and really a fun piece to listen to. Rosephanie Powell is a voice professor at Auburn, and so that's where a lot of her work resides, although she's a tremendous composer and arranger as well. Now, a lot of her compositions are compositions. They aren't arrangements of spirituals. They are straightforward choral pieces, newly composed. But she does do some arrangement of spirituals, And I thought that we'd listen to this setting of Every Time I Feel the Spirit, which is a well-known spiritual, that she arranged for treble voices, SSAA. So I thought that would be kind of a different thing to listen to here. Now, one thing I did want to mention is that she edited a book called William Grant Still, an Art Song Collection of the solo art songs that William Grant Still wrote. And I think that that is really important to kind of remember the predecessors in the field and help distribute their music in ways that people can then perform it. So Rosephine Powell does a great job of doing that. Let's listen to her arrangement of Every Time I Feel the Spirit. I just want to pop on, and we only have one more arranger left, but I do want to say that something's happened to my chat window, and I no longer am seeing it. So I'm sorry if you're asking questions. I hope the conversation's going well, but I just want to let you know that I'm not seeing it right now, so I apologize. But we'll continue on here with our final arranger for this evening, Dr. Rollo Dilworth. Now, he has some Chicago connections in that he earned his doctoral degree from Northwestern University and taught at North Park University prior to going to Temple. Now, he also was the director of the Music Institute of the Chicago Children's Choir. So a really phenomenal person here. I got to work with him one time and really learned a lot from him. One thing that you'll notice in this arrangement of Walk in Jerusalem is his piano writing, which is really, really fine. A lot of Rollo's works have really great piano parts that aren't accompaniment, but are really in service to or in addition to the rest of the music. Like some of the other composers we've talked about tonight, Dilworth arranges spirituals, but also writes other newly composed choral music as well. So, last piece for this part of the presentation, let's listen to Walk in Jerusalem. I hope that this has been kind of a fun survey of this great tradition in choral music, one that is unique to America and has a centuries-old tradition that I think is worth exploring more deeply than perhaps we have in the past. Now, I do want to share a few things before we get to our moment of Zen, just a few housekeeping things. First of all, I put together a couple slides here of selected further reading, and I'm going to go through them fairly quickly, but remember, all of these presentations from CMS University are recorded and saved on our YouTube channel. So you can always go back and pause these slides and jot down the authors of any sources you're interested in checking out. The ones on this page that I'd in particular like to recommend is the book by Floyd, The Power of Black Music, Interpreting Its History from Africa to the United States. That's a very fine book, as well as the Newman, Go Down Moses, a celebration of the African American spiritual. On this other page, like I said at the beginning here, the Andre J. Thomas book really guided a lot of my thinking when I was preparing this presentation, so I'd recommend Way Over in Beulah Land. I'd also recommend the Bernice Johnson Reagan, If You Don't Go, Don't Hinder Me, the African American sacred song tradition. And then finally, the Evelyn Davidson White. I've mentioned this in a previous CMSU session, but this book, Choral Music by African American Composers, a selected annotated bibliography, and the one above it, the Walker Hill, From Spirituals to Symphony, African American Women Composers and Their Music. So a really good source for helping diversify our understanding of what choral music is and who it's by. I hope you've enjoyed this evening as much as I have, and I invite you to come back next week when I'll be interviewing 4 soloists who would have appeared with CMS this season, but unfortunately our performances were canceled due to COVID. But I will be interviewing them about their journey, their education, and how they prepare to sing a solo role, and how even when you're singing as a quartet of soloists, that's an ensemble singing, how is that different than singing in a choir? So join us for that conversation. Hopefully I'll have the chat window working by then, and then you, the viewers, if you're watching the live stream live, will then be able to ask them questions. I do hope that you'll like this video. Press that little like, thumbs up button, and subscribe to our channel if you're not already, and share this with a friend. It's really great to see these sessions take off, and we really hope to spread our community and grow our community with anyone who's interested. So please share these videos with a friend. If you're enjoying this free programming and have the means to donate, we would appreciate it. All of the links, not only for the registration for next week through Eventbrite, but these donation links are available in the video description below. And we thank you for your generosity in advance. Finally, our moment of Zen, our kind of palate cleanser before we say goodnight, is an arrangement of the great evening hymn, Abide With Me, by Moses Hogan. Now, I guess technically this isn't a spiritual because this is a 19th century piece, but it's a really beautiful, beautiful arrangement of a beautiful hymn, and I hope you enjoy it.
With me.
Thank you, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this evening, and I hope you'll join me next week for another session of CMS University. Until then, take care, stay healthy, stay safe, and have a good night.